Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. Today, we're talking about books. And we're going to talk about books all the time because it's one of our favorite things. But today's just kind of focusing in on what are some major books in your walk, in your Christian walk, in your faith, that became milestones or waypoints in your journey in terms of how you evolved sort of your thinking as a Christian, right? This is happening all the time. It's micro and macro. And I think in this one, we're talking more macro. Shifts in thinking, shifts in application, shifts in maybe how you lead your family. There's a lot of little things I think to explore, but let's talk about waypoints. And I think it makes sense to start at the beginning. Maybe the first few books that kind of led you down, a serious Christian path. Maybe it was just a Christian path. Maybe it was a serious thing or you found a real denomination or whatever. Peter.
Yeah. Well, there are gateway drugs, and I guess there's gateway scholars.
There are.
And I know this sounds ordinary. It sounds predictable, but for me, it was. In fact, R.C. Sproul.
It should be.
In fact, I didn't even know what that name was. So here I am. I'm in seminary. I'll say it. I was at Fuller Theological Seminary. Neo-Orthodoxy. Karl Barth.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I was Reformed. Didn't even really know what Reformed meant. And then I get introduced providentially to R.C. Sproul. And I was not fully convinced of the doctrines of grace at that time, but I remember reading Chosen by God. And I'm sure a lot of people have read Chosen by God. And what I really enjoyed about that book was him describing his own struggle with the doctrines of grace and then coming to understand God's grace in it and embracing it and seeing the beauty of it all. So it was Chosen by God. And then, of course, I had to go right into Willing to Believe. And I did that. And each of those books brought up other authors that I read. So Fuller was taking me on one track, and like a branch of a tree, I just went off on Sproul.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, it's ubiquitous. People say his impact that he's had on people. He's had a huge impact on me, on his training ministry, teaching ministry, and honestly, he still does.
Yeah.
It's been impactful.
Yeah. That's a good one. There's nothing to be embarrassed about that. R.C. Sproul is a gateway. Yeah, right. Yeah. He's a gateway theologian because of his he's so accessible. Right. And how he breaks these things down.
His brilliance, I mean, he's a bona fide scholar, but his brilliance is able just to articulate deeper theological doctrines in everyday language, and yet not lose the impact of the doctrine itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Oh, we just listened to R.C. Sproul in a class on the covenants.
Yeah.
It was excellent.
Yeah.
And it was also 20 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
We listened to him for so long. Yeah.
Was that during his fro period? Yeah.
No, but it was sort of towards the latter times.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe 20 years ago was just 2004, so he was
right.
It would have been very relevant to most of us.
I do remember showing when I was a youth pastor in seminary, showing that his youth version, and that was like from 1982, and it was very 80s.
Yeah.
And he was trying to look all hip and cool.
Yeah.
It's like RC that doesn't work.
Oh, yeah. Chalkboards. He used them from the 80s all the way.
Yeah.
That was the thing. Yeah. So how about you, Shane?
So Sproul was second for me, but first was John Piper.
Okay.
And I actually had a missions class, and one of our textbooks for that missions class was Let the Nations Be Glad, which was John Piper's book on the supremacy of God in missions.
Yeah.
And of course, that's where I kind of first heard of the Westminster Confession of Faith. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in Him. And so that just got me. I remember the professor specifically saying, you got to take Piper with a grain of salt. Like, he's great on missions, but he's a Calvinist, and you got to be careful, know. And that sent me down a path of saying, I've never heard someone talk about God that way, about his sovereignty, his supremacy. And so Piper was talking unlike anyone that I was reading at the time, any of my theology textbooks. And so I was like, I've got to understand what Reformed theology is, what this dirty word Calvinism's all about. I've got to go figure it out. And which led me pretty quickly to reading books by R.C. Sproul. But yeah, it was Piper for me. So
that's interesting because I was just the opposite. I started with Sproul, but second for me was Piper.
Yeah.
But he was very, very good.
Oh, yeah.
And the book I really liked of his is, I think it's called The Justification of God.
Okay.
And that is his whole doctorate thesis that he turned into a book. So here he is teaching at Bethel Seminary, runs into Romans 9, realizes he has to figure this out because, he just got to make sense of it. So he takes a sabbatical, writes this book, does all this research, and says, I've got to preach this. So then, he becomes a pastor. But I would say for those listening, that maybe the doctrines of grace are something you're on the fence. Maybe it's just you want to know more, but you just can't go there. I would recommend highly those 3 books. I would read Justification of God last. That's a little bit more scholarly. Chosen by God, Willing to Believe are more for the lay people, but well written. And then Justification of God.
Yeah. Third. Yeah. Those are all excellent. And I Piper's been super influential in bringing people over, like, to the Reformed tradition from a soteriological perspective.
Right.
Because he's not actually in the PCA.
No, he is independent Baptist. Yeah.
Wait, he's not? Disregard everything.
Yeah. No, he's brilliant. And everyone, when I was in school, in college, all of my roommates, including me, we listened to his daily, releases and stuff. And, he was influential. So I grew up in the Reformed tradition. So I grew up kind of in the faith. And a lot of these things my dad was helpful in. I'd say one of the pivotal books I read in high school was The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination by Lorraine Bettner, which is considered kind of a classic work on that. And my dad just like, read this and we'll talk about it later. It was dense, but it was one of the few books that I always felt like I didn't feel like it, but I always thought I had to prove election to people until I read that book, and I was like, I think it's backwards. I think they have to kind of prove to me why it's not a concept after having kind of read through that. And it was helpful because it helped me gain an appreciation for the historical position of Reformed, ecclesiology and salvation, and that the proof is kind of in the pudding. If you're really looking at the scripture across, there's just proof text upon proof text that can be kind of connected and threaded and understood, and it's like the case against election is so much harder. Like it's like hard to unsee that, and so that book was kind of pivotal for me because I was about to get into college, and I was going to go meet a bunch of other Christians that weren't Reformed, basically, and this was something we talked about all the time because salvation's a gift and you have to open it. And I'm like, yeah, but you're dead, you can't open it. And happy to say one of my college roommates ended up Reformed. Well, he was already a Christian, a strong one. So I don't take any credit here, but that book was probably the hardest one I'd read up at that point, and helpful.
So my last duty station before I came here, I was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and for some reason, I would run into a lot of Army chaplains that didn't like to talk about theology. But I'm working in my office, and a new guy came in, and he's just leaning against my door jamb. He goes, "Hey, so I heard your endorser's then I was ARP. I said, yeah. He goes, oh, so you're one of those Calvinists. And I said, yes, I am. And he's all, well, I'm a free Methodist, and I believe in free will. So we just started talking. Every day he would come in. It'd be 20 minutes of something. And then I said, I think you should read this book, Justification of God by John Piper. Yeah. And he reads it. And he reads it. And he gets in it. And he's asking more questions. What does he do? He switches denominations from Free Methodist to ARP. So when you're confronted with this, and you have the scriptural evidence right there, and it just I don't want to say it forces you to see it. I don't mean it's like a coercion, but you are confronted with something that you just have to say, well, if it doesn't mean this,
Right.
then what does it mean?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Another book I really was really helpful during that time too, is I was trying to process the big brains. There's a book called A Journey in Grace, a theological novel, and it's a little book, and it's a story about somebody processing coming to the Reformed faith, right, or coming to Reformed
nice.
soteriology. And so, all the questions that arise, and it's really written from a very human standpoint of what you're feeling, what you're thinking as you're going through that process, and some of the emotions and some of the visceral reactions when you hear some of those doctrines and stuff. And so, very helpful little book. I'm trying to remember, it's either Blanchard or Belcher. I can't remember which he wrote it, but A Journey in Grace, a theological novel, is a very easy read, and I think would be really helpful to folks as well. So it was to me.
Yeah.
What are some other Waypoint books?
I know another one for me was, it kind of is at the same time, and I can't remember the exact sequence of books, but I remember reading Van Til on apologetics and Greg Bahnsen on apologetics, and also kind of postmillennialism. I remember his book Victory in Jesus was very influential, and that was just kind of a major shift for me of just how I viewed so many things with that apologetic standpoint, with that eschatology kind of underpinning so many other things. And so but those were really influential. That was a major shift, I remember. Yeah.
How about you, Pastor? Any other Waypoint books?
Oh, it's just hard. It's you almost have to.
The stacks are so high in your office. How do I pick one?
Yeah, like how do you pick one? And I don't want to make it sound like the pivotal books were all about election and predestination, because they aren't.
Right.
But there were books that just opened up the whole, what I would say, the beauty of the Reformed faith.
Yeah.
Not just doctrines of grace, but just like what it is. But it's just now I'm under pressure and I got to think of these titles. But Machen, Christianity and liberalism.
Yeah, that's
so
a great book.
it's not a book about soteriology per se, but when you understand the history of what's going on, and you understand the courage of this man, you understand the conviction of his faith and what he's doing, it's informative, it's inspiring, and I would say that was definitely one. J.I. Packer, Knowing God, was another one. So there's so many others that are just very practical, very, very Christian, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a Calvinist to read Knowing God, but you're going to get a lot out of it.
I've got one. I read it in college, and I read it after college, and I need to read it again. I was actually just thinking about it. The Mortification of Sin. By John Owens. Yeah, that was pretty pivotal, because I felt like I didn't really even like assess sin in like a really spiritually rigorous way before I read that book. It's not to say that I don't think, we've always been very confessional as a family growing up. We made our apologies and we did it with a happy heart and all that, but there's something about that book in terms of, it's like getting a porterhouse. Every time you sit down to read it,
Right.
You're gonna cut off a piece and you have to chew it, and then you're like, that was tasty. Did I really, really understand it? Because I feel like I need to reread that section, and you do, because Owen is he's dense, but it's not a long book.
No.
And so if you're willing to take a page or two a day, and you interact with the book a little bit, asking yourself questions, it was a mirror, right? It's designed to be a mirror, and you can feel Owen's pain in the pages of his own sin. And you can sense the seriousness of that. And of course, Owen's about as serious as they get, but so is sin. Right? And so I don't feel like there's a lot of practical handling of the topic of mortification of sin. I think, we talk about it from the pulpit some, but books don't sell if they're like this, I don't think. And thank goodness John Owen doesn't need to sell anything. He's long gone. But it is a gem. Yeah. And most of those Puritan works kind of are, but this one stands out because it's unique work.
Agreed.
Have you guys have read those?
Yeah.
Owen.
That's my
tough.
favorite Puritan paperback. I think
Yeah.
would be Mortification of Sin for sure.
There's been some older ones too. There's Irenaeus' book. When you think of the time frame of where the church was then, and literally like the 2nd century, he wrote. I think it's called "The Fundamentals of Apostolic Preaching."
Oh yeah.
It's not a large book. It's very readable. I mean, we're talking a 1 to 3 day read. Depending. Very easy to read. Very easy to understand. But it just gives you insights of just the faith of that time period of the early church fathers. What is said about the faith and what isn't said about the faith. So when you look at the Apostles' Creed and the fundamentals of who we are, mere Christianity. And then C.S. Lewis. I didn't even mention him, but I do. I like C.S. Lewis as well.
Yeah, I was going to mention Screw Tape. I mean, Mere Christianity. I don't know where you start with Lewis. You can pretty much pick up any book and be edified.
Yeah.
Screw Tape
Do a
letters.
whole podcast on.
We should.
Yeah,
I'll make a note.
Yeah.
Because I think Screw Tape letters. You already talked about Lewis a good bit, and it was really excellent.
Yeah.
Screw Tape letters is it's like that Mortification of Sin book in the sense that it's mirroring something. It's mirroring your own thoughts.
Yes.
And you're like, oh shoot, I think like a devil. Like what? Right? But it is about like seeing into your soul, and those are impactful. When I first read that, I was like, what is going on here? Are there demons around? Like, this makes sense to me.
Yeah.
This is holy war.
I'd say for me, another book, and I think this is unusual because usually those major shifts, that you have, and those are more theological, and so it's those books that tend to stick out, or something that's philosophical, or something that really moved you. Things that are more devotional tend to they meant something to you, but they kind of fade to the background. But one book that has profoundly affected me was A Praying Life by Paul Miller. And I think my greatest plug for the book would be it's the first book on prayer that, rather than making me feel guilty about my prayer life, actually made me just want to put down the book and pray. And so I don't know that it's made me better at praying, but it's made me pray. It's like, and giving you the freedom that you don't have to be better at prayer. You just need to be living a praying life by praying. And
it's like, what books inspire you?
Right. But there's been a lot of practical things that book did in my life of that I look back on now and seeing answer to prayer, and just being like, man, I'm so thankful for that book, because it came at a time when my kids were younger, and it started me down a path of praying for their spouses and praying for their futures and praying for our home and praying for things that I just wasn't really on my radar, praying out, into the next 10, 15 years. And now we're past that 10, 15 year mark, and you're looking back and seeing the fulfillment of prayer. And so just really thankful for that book. Meant a lot to me. Still does. But.
I read a book called The Divine Art of Contentment in college by Thomas Watson. He's another Puritan, and that was pivotal for me. Not that I've ever struggled with like depression or anything, but it's one of those helpful prisms to put everything on, which is contentment's a practice, contentment's a gift, and it's a gift you do with the Spirit, kind of like anything we do really. But contentment has been as a concept has been one of the greatest ways for me to battle the culture. Because the culture is not about contentment, it's about distraction or happiness. I mean, people say I want to do it to be happy. I'm always just like, I don't even know what you're saying out loud. I know what joy and contentment look like, and they look like you doing your job and gratefully doing it, like, and then hugging your spouse at home at the end of the day. Like, I know what those things are because this book helped me see what these things were, and that you're not blaming other people. You're just not. Like they don't really talk about happiness as a concept, because I don't even know that the Puritans wrestled with that, because contentment is such a deeper concept, right? And you find joy and all this gratification. But it was a pivotal book, and I've read it a few times, and I'll probably read it a few more times, because at the end of the day, we need to be encouraged right? And that book is about encouragement, as the opposite of mortification of sin, where I'm like, oh man, that's the worst. I'm the worst.
Yeah.
The contentment book feels very empowering,
Yeah.
to be in Christ.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think in addition to what book, I think about what you said about that prayer book. It just made me wanted to put it down and start praying. Well, I think some encouragement I'd give to our listeners is just start reading, right? So I remember being on deployment, my parents gave me a Kindle, and I'm not a technical person, I like books, I like pages, I like underlining, but I realized in this tiny little contraption, I can literally fit an entire library. And so I'm just buying books, for dirt cheap, on Kindle, and I'm reading, and I read so much on Kindle. And I said, man, when I read a boy, I'm going to be reading a book a week, Well, then life hits you and you don't.
Yeah.
And then my current reading now as a pastor, I'm reading great stuff.
Yeah.
And I've read books about this, like, is your study preparation devotional reading, growing reading, or is that work reading,
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, to me, I get a lot out of it, like spiritually, because you're reading from great scholars, right? And you're reading great works, but it is more technical. But I kind of missed, and I just recently, in the last few months, I said, I got to get back on the program. So what I started doing is getting books I want to read, and I bring them in my office, and I say, okay, time limit, 1 chapter in the morning when I start. Just read 1 chapter. When that chapter is done, put it away. But in a week, you're done with a book.
Yeah.
And then you say, man, it's like working out. Why don't I do this all the time, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to our listeners, especially to our men, I mean, we've mentioned some great books. Don't feel like you need to crush them in a day,
Yeah.
But put a limit on it. Read 1 chapter, and pretty soon you're through dozens of books, and you'll grow in it.
Yeah. Agreed.
And I'd just add to that too. I remember too when someone gave me the freedom or permission to not finish a book.
Oh yeah.
It was like that was so freeing. You know what I mean? It's like because I always felt like once you open it up and you get into chapter 1, you've got to read the whole thing. And I remember reading someone who said, you know what? If you're not getting anything out of it, if you don't like it, or if you're reading a novel and the story's bad, put it down, move on. It's like a movie. Like turn it off if you don't like it. And but it really is interesting of how helpful that is to be able to have the permission not to read, but then also to realize like there are some things that are just there's a great chapter. I mean, one of the most famous introductions to a book is the introduction to the death by the death of Christ.
Correct. Yeah.
That's Owen as well, right?
Yeah.
And and so sometimes there are things in a book where you can read 1 chapter, you can skim something, and you still get a lot out of it. And I think having that permission of I don't have to read the whole thing. I'll look at a chapter or see what's interesting to me. And I don't know about you guys anymore. I always, like, before I ever buy a book now, I always read the introduction. I always read because I already wanted to say, do I want to invest time and money in this? But but back to that point of, man, just read. And I don't feel like you have to, just because you got into something, you have to stay in it.
Books are seasonal.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're more relevant than other times. Sometimes you need to read them again.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just read a section.
Yeah.
I think that's all good.
Yeah, and there's a common denominator. I mean, just people that I've encountered and met and talked like, wow, this guy's amazing. It's always the common denominator. They're always well read.
Yeah.
They're reading a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
And reading will grow you. Good books, good authors, right? You gotta, just like good news, you gotta read the right stuff. But it's so edifying.
Yeah. Agreed. And if you want to talk about books again, we'll be around.
Yeah.
That's what we talk about all the time, mostly.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.